Now, we've sort of mentioned many different things here, and this is a very rich area to talk about, and we only have limited time. So let me dig into some of these issues in a bit more detail, but at the same time, let's try and keep our dialogue going relatively quickly so that we can cover as many of these things as possible. And for those of you watching, I'd like to remind you that you can send us your questions. I'm sure a jingle will go across the bottom of the screen telling you where to send them. So please get your questions coming in, because we'll be taking them at the end of the session. So if I look at what's happened over the last couple of years, we had the industry growing strongly until 2019, reaching a peak of emissions of 914 million tonnes or something like that, according to IATA. And then in 2020, that reducing almost to half, 488 million tonnes. Is this going to make a big difference to the long-term projections for where the industry is going? And the second part of my question is, Jonathan mentioned a number of initiatives in terms of trying to map out a pathway to 2050 that have been done by Sustainable Aviation in the UK. We've got this new initiative coming out of Europe with the Waypoint 2050 from the calling for carbon neutrality by 2050. We've got ATAG's report from last year, which was still referring to the industry goals of a 50% reduction by 2005. Has the pandemic caused a bit of confusion here, or is the industry still on track and unified in terms of what it's trying to do? Michael, let me address that to you first, and then maybe Jonathan or others might need to chip in.
So just to maybe give a bit of perspective of what that means, our forecasts of emissions out to 2050, taking into account the impacts of the pandemic, say that our emissions footprint in 2050 will be some 16% less than what we had anticipated it to be prior to COVID. So even 3 decades from now, the impacts of the pandemic are still going to be felt. But it still means that even with that reduction, our emissions footprint potentially, if we don't do nothing more from today, could reach some 1.8 billion tonnes of CO2. And as you referred to, Paul, our existing 50% target is to get to 325 million tonnes by 2050. I think that really gives you a sense of how difficult this really is. Now, what's I think very positive is that we now know through the Waypoint 2050 report that there are a number of different pathways, a number of different combinations of action that can get us there, and indeed can take us even further. And I think the industry message is pretty clear. We have a existing target, which is extremely ambitious. I've given you the sort of order of magnitude there, but it is achievable. And we think that a net zero emissions future for aviation on a global basis is possible, is feasible by around 2060, maybe 2065. But it's clear that some regions, and Europe is a good example, some regions are going to be able to go faster than that. And I think if you look at this carefully, all of the industry announcements that have been made over the past few months are very much in line with that overall position.
Okay. Jonathan, do you want to add anything there in terms of the European initiative?
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. So, and it is clear to us that different parts of the world are, first of all, facing different pressures regarding climate change. So here in Europe, particularly, we saw in sort of 2019 and early 2020 the sort of flight shaming movement that was gaining momentum. And secondly, different parts of the world have better access or different access to new technology, sustainable aviation fuels, MBMs. So I think so it's quite natural that some parts of the world will be able to move to the 2050 target earlier. But that said, I think there's real momentum, and I believe that there is a real opportunity for the industry to converge around the same ambition, particularly importantly in the lead up to the ICAO General Assembly in sort of October of next year.
Okay, good. So things are on track, which I guess is good. I want to change topic a little bit. I mean, we've talked a lot about the pathway, so it's good to know that there are a number of pathways out there. over the last 24 hours here at the colloque, we've heard a lot about different technological solutions that are being envisaged for aviation. I'd like to try and get your perspectives on what you think the most promising ones of those are. And I know that the industry has invested a lot of time and effort into developing, in the first phase, sustainable alternative fuels that can replace kerosene in the short term to enable significant emissions reductions to take place. But it seems to be progressing quite slowly. So how are we doing on that? Maybe, Nancy, I can ask you to comment on that first of all.
Well, sustainable aviation fuel is actually really the greatest near-term, medium-term, and long-term opportunity for this industry. And we've actually come a long way. You're right, there hasn't been a significant quantity of that available yet, but we literally built this industry from the ground, starting in sort of 2006 plus, as we had consortia efforts to find a pathway to have even ensuring safety of alternative fuels in aviation. So I think we've come a long way, but we really do need to scale up supply, and part of that is making it more cost competitive. So I would challenge you a little bit in terms of, saying that it hasn't really developed all that far. What we need to do now, you heard Jonathan talk about some of their agreements. We were really proud that 3 of our members during the pandemic announced a new agreement to take that sustainable aviation fuel at SFO. All of our members are engaged in offtake agreements, and that's part of the market signal. But what we really need is for governments to step up, as they did for ground-based alternative fuel, as they have done for decades and decades for fossil-based fuel, and meet us halfway. We need the right kinds of support, policy support, to help make this commercially sustainable and cost competitive. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as conventional fuel, but we need to bring those prices down. And we are committed to significant quantities of SAF, literally in the near term, medium term, and long term. And we've really worked hard to create the levers to make that happen. And we need more work from the governments.
Okay, well, it's an interesting message, Nancy, because I would also make the point that I think in North America things have advanced faster than they have done here in Europe, and I'd like to hear a perspective about that. I don't know whether Michael or Jonathan or Anne would like to say something about where we are in Europe on this. It seems to me that governments in Europe could do a lot more to actually help move this development and if you like, guarantee and safeguard the huge investments that are necessary in order to make this a reality. And
happy to add on to that. And as Nancy says, I think we have made great progress, and we are trying to create a new energy system here. And I don't not normally in the game of plugging Bill Gates, but his latest book, Managing How to Avoid a Climate Crisis, it's an excellent book, recommended to everybody. But he says that creating new energy systems in the past has taken from coal to oil to gas takes 60 years. So I think credit to the industry. In 10 years, we are now on the cusp of seeing half a dozen dedicated SAF plants being constructed. So I think you'll see over the next 5 years quite a big, significant progress. But as Nancy says, the key is policy support. We know they work technically, we know they're sustainable, but we now have to prove that they can be produced at scale economically. And so policy support is absolutely key. Now, we have had some good moves here in Europe. But I think we wait in the next sort of 6 to 8 weeks, we will get an announcement from the EU around a policy, which I think will be a game changer, a mandate on sustainable aviation fuels. We sincerely hope that they will start with intra-EU emissions for a whole bunch of reasons, but we think that will provide the price signal to attract the necessary investment to get these plants built. And the volumes we're talking about 5% by 2030, just in the UK alone. That will be 10 plants, and across Europe, you're probably looking at 30 to 40 plants, getting towards 30% by 2050. In the UK alone, that will be 50 plants. So we are right on the cusp of this happening, and I think we'll see some policy moves that will accelerate that.
Okay, good. Anne, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that sustainable fuels are, with fleet renewal, the only major short-term lever for airlines that are compatible with the current technology, in fact. So together with our partners that are Airbus, Aéroports de Paris, Safran and NG in France, we are looking for means to take the huge investments that are needed to start the production, to make it economically viable. Of course, we will wait for the governments to implement some incentives for airlines to be able to face the huge cost. For the moment, it's more than 3 times more expensive than conventional fuel. But on our side in France, we committed to introduce 2% of SAF by 2025. So this helps to secure some volumes in order to build a mature system sector and to optimize the production and to produce larger quantities and to little by little reduce this price. I would not like to forget the fleet renewal, because the COVID crisis really pushed us to accelerate our fleet renewal. At the moment, we are securing 1 million per year, even in the deepest crisis, to renew our long haul with 350s, medium haul with 220s. And I think at the moment, minus 25% by each new generation aircraft, we must not forget it's our first level.
Okay. Good. So very much a focus, I think, in the short to medium term on sustainable alternative fuels. But yesterday we heard, and this morning from the presentation from Arthur D. Little, a lot of talk about some of the other future technologies that may be possible, including hydrogen. And I also observed that potentially, is there a danger that we're seeing the two biggest manufacturing groups going in slightly different directions in terms of their technological development? And what would that mean for operators if in the future, if that were the case? Who would like to comment on the hydrogen issue? Jonathan?
Yeah, no, very happy to. And we think they're absolutely complementary. There's no silver bullet in addressing our climate change. We need everything. And we think that the hydrogen and hybrid electric aircraft, they're primarily going to be for the short-haul mission. Yeah, we don't think that the technology will develop enough to access long-haul flights. Whereas sustainable aviation fuels will absolutely be the solution for long-haul flights. So we see there's complete complementarity. But again, on those disruptive technologies, they're probably 15 years away before we see any significant penetration. So the important thing is that SAF is now, so it can help all parts of our operations decarbonize in the near future, and it is realistically the only option for long haul.
Okay, interesting. Anyone else want to join on hydrogen?
Yeah, I would add that really it is an all of the above strategy, and that's the point. And I think it's very healthy that some of the manufacturers are pointing in different directions, because that is going to accelerate opportunities in those multiple directions. I do think on our end, hydrogen, as Jonathan said, is a longer term opportunity. And so our caution would be not to lose sight of what can be done here and now, at the same time that we and our government partners and our university partners and others invest in the long term. So you have to get that balance right. You can't miss what can give you the benefits in the near term for that shiny new object that may be 15, 20 years off.
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to just move on a little bit and talk about, some of the other things that have been talked about in changes of an operational kind, in terms of there even being things like, slowing down aircraft in flight, reintroducing fueling stops on long-haul flights, etc. Yesterday from Violetta Bulc, we also heard, of course, in Europe, there's a huge focus on high-speed rail. And we've heard from Anne this morning that one of the conditions of the state loan to Air France was to stop all flights under 2.5 hours that can be done with the train de grande vitesse here in France.
Yeah.
What are your experiences in other parts of the world, Nancy? I mean, high-speed rail in the US seems to be a non-starter. So, how are we addressing this?
Well, I do think that it is and will be enabled in the few corridors that are capable of that. But obviously, geographically in the United States, we're not looking at high-speed rail for a long time. And you're also got to think about the life cycle, greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts of alternative modes. So there can be tremendous impacts of high-speed rail when you take all of that into account. I think the more important thing to do is look at carbon and environmental impact is what the enemy is. It's not the mode of transportation. It is not the business model, whether it is a short haul, long haul, or whether it is an alternative to go to some kind of rail infrastructure. It is how do we as aviation account for that carbon and the other emissions and impacts within what we do. And I think that's the right focus, not to really think about modal shift or other things, but to get our business right. And that's where we're entirely focused with sustainable aviation fuel technology. And as you mentioned, Paul, we still have some things to get on the operational side. And the airlines are very focused on doing that. So that I think we have a good future, but we got to keep at it.
Okay, great. Anne?
Yeah, maybe I think things are a bit different in France because high-speed trains have been developed in France for 40 years. So I think that here, because the investments have been done, intermodality is a potential solution. We are proposing with the French Railway SNCF intermodal solution since 1995, so 25 years ago. I think we can do more. We have projects with SNCF to enhance the customer experience, to enhance the digitization. We have also challenges on the physical experience. I think we have to think of our future terminals or airport design with a combination of and the physical experience with the luggage.
Okay, good. Okay, so some interesting things there. Let's move on to one of the other sort of sensitive topics that we've had to deal with over the last few years, and that's the issue of economic measures. And I think this is brought even more into perspective now as we're going, coming out of the end of this pandemic. Governments have had to invest enormous amounts of money in keeping the economies going, keeping people in employment and everything else. And at some point, they're going to need to refill the coffers again. So is it a question? We've already got two in place. One is the EU ETS. The other one is CORSIA. Are these measures now still valid, or are we likely to see a resurgence in ideas of taxing the industry even more? And is that positive or is that a negative result? Michael, do you want to mention that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, taxation to me is a real worry because it's a very easy knee-jerk reaction from a government to say, as you say, we need to refill our coffers. Let's look around for the easy targets. And what I'd say is, what I think is really illustrative of the issue is if you do take by way of comparison the EU ETS for aviation and CORSIA, two forms of market-based measure, two forms of economic regulation, but done with a very different approach. EU ETS was imposed on the aviation sector to legal challenges, to threats of trade war, to a lot of opposition from the industry because of many of the aspects of it really were not favourable to the sector and not really achieving the environmental objectives that it purports to achieve. Whereas you take CORSIA, which was developed with a collaborative approach between industry and governments. It's usual, probably unique for an industry to go to ICAO and say, we want to be regulated here. It was something that the industry asked for, but it meant that we were able to dialogue with governments and with ICAO to construct a scheme which was to everybody's benefit. Now, the final outcome, of course, is not perfect. It's not everybody's ideal solution because it was built on compromise and consensus. And so what I'd say is when governments are looking at this issue of economic regulation, let's try and do it in the CORSIA collaborative spirit rather than having regulation imposed from on high that the industry just simply can't live with, particularly in the post-pandemic period.
Okay, I think the other aspect of, well, of course, is CORSIA is a global solution, whereas a lot of governments seem to be looking at local solutions to this issue at the moment, which, of course, from if you're an airline operating in many different countries, raises lots and lots of issues. Any other comments on this, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, and we are a global industry, so we need a global solution. And CORSIA is the correct instrument for addressing aviation's carbon emissions. But we recognise that the EU ETS, it filled a gap in terms of covering intra-EU emissions before CORSIA came into place. But we now, our expectation is that CORSIA will replace the EU ETS because the EU ETS will only ever be intra-EU emissions. So therefore, it's not going to address global emissions. So the right answer is CORSIA, and we expect that hopefully by the mandatory phase of CORSIA to replace the EU ETS. But on your question of taxation, taxation doesn't do anything for climate change. And we have really strong experience of this in the United Kingdom. We have the world's highest aviation tax. It's twice as punitive as the next aviation tax, the air passenger duty. We now pay $5 billion a year in aviation tax, and it doesn't save a ton of CO2. So taxes do nothing for the environment. They're the wrong instrument. You need market-based measures like CORSIA.
Okay. Any other comments, Nancy, or?
Yeah, I would add, I think people give CORSIA, they don't give it its due, really. The world came together, as you noted. We brought in a number of countries that, frankly, have been skeptical about climate agreements and have either, have come in and embraced CORSIA. But I think critically, CORSIA also has a consensus-based expert approach to making sure that you have emissions units and environmental rigor that the environmental groups and others help design. And so the validity of that system is really significant, and it creates a tremendous signal around the world for the quality of the type of market-based measure you need to have. And it remains the only global market-based measure today.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe very quickly, two things. You know that EU is in the process of revising the ETS directive. So we think there is a kind of risk of competition distortion for European airlines associated with the risk of carbon leakage if European regulations are tougher than international ones. So we have to be very careful. And regarding taxation, as we said, we need very important investment to reach our environmental goals and to finance the fleet renewal, the sustainable fuels. So at a moment where the aviation sector is deeply hurt by the crisis, any taxation that is not directly directed to the investment for the environmental transition would really jeopardize our trajectory.
Okay, yeah, interesting message here. So economic measures can have an impact, but they need to be done properly, and they need to be ideally done globally in order to have the right sort of effect. Okay, we're in the last few minutes of the discussion before we hand over to you and get your questions. I'm already receiving some of them here, and we'll launch those in a few seconds. But as we bring this discussion to a conclusion, we've heard about it seems like enormous efforts the industry is already undertaking to address this issue. Naturally, more needs to be done. I've also heard from you that it's not possible for you to do it on your own. You need support from governments. What ideally now, if you can sum it up, maybe I'll take each one of you in turn as a sort of conclusion. What would you ask of governments now in terms of the ideal policy elements that they need to put in place so that we can accelerate the work that is ongoing in addressing this issue? Who'd like to go first on that one? Let me see. Jonathan, okay.
Yeah, I'm very happy to. So for us, the focus is sustainable aviation fuels. It's absolutely the priority because we said it's the earliest opportunity to make a significant impact. And we have made very good progress here in the EU. So we're looking at a mandate, but it has to be a very carefully designed mandate to avoid competitive distortion. But we think if it is carefully designed, it can send the right price signal, can help us attract that investment to get those first-of-a-kind plants built.
Okay. Michael, any comments?
Yeah, I'm going to be in violent agreement with Jonathan. SAF has really got to be the key area of focus. I think individual governments have to go big time on SAF investment. Mandates is one policy option, of course, but I'd also ask governments to look at, in this period of post-COVID recovery, where they're looking to regenerate their economies at large, think about putting public funds into SAF projects. There's the scope for massive win-win situations there. You create jobs, you regenerate areas, you build a brand new industry through public money, and you also help the key aviation sector continue on its journey to decarbonisation. So SAF is absolutely where it's at, but think of the different policy incentives and think of where you can put public money.
Okay. Nancy?
Yeah, you're going to hear a chorus here, but I think, as concrete as we can be on sustainable aviation fuel support. So, for example, in the United States, we are seeking a SAF blenders tax credit at a level that could help address the fact that ground-based alternative fuel has had such significant support, and we haven't really been able to have that kind of policy support. So we're trying to get as concrete as possible. We can't fail to mention, though, that air traffic management efficiency also is a near-term opportunity, and it's another area where governments can do more. The United States really needs to turn to more performance-based navigation, and we are proud to see that the European governments are saying they're committed to the single European sky and programs there. So there's a lot to be done, and we're glad that industry and governments are really focused on it.
Okay. Finally, Anne?
I will be the last of the chorus.
We didn't rehearse this, by the way, so it's interesting to get a chorus.
But I think it's obvious that we need a strong commitment from our governments and the EU on SAF. The French government is really committed to working on the two issues that limit the SAF supply. The supply by encouraging the development of plants, and also the accessibility with some mandates. So in France, it's 2% by 2025, 5% by 2030. And we need the federation of the ecosystem. And I think the governments are trying to build it now.
Okay. So what I'm hearing from this discussion is that very much the focus is still very much on the environment in terms of the views of the operators. A lot of efforts are going into a variety of different approaches to reduce emissions. A lot of focus in the short to medium term on alternative fuels. That doesn't exclude by any means some of the bigger, longer term solutions like hydrogen or electric aircraft, but we're seeing the focus very much on alternative fuels. It appears from the discussion that the solutions are already there. It's now a question of scalability. Can we grow the supply? And what we've heard is a very strong request that from a policy perspective, that governments get firmer behind this in terms of putting the right frameworks in place to incentivize investment in order to be able to scale this up. If I've summarized that more or less, I think as you said. We're now going to move to your questions. So let's launch the jingle for the questions, and then I have a number of questions here that I'm going to pose to you that we've received from the audience. Okay, so welcome back, and now it's over to you, and we're going to get your questions, and it's a great opportunity to put everybody on the spot. You'll have to excuse me because some of these are in French, and I'm having to translate them directly. You're going to hear more of my French in the second table ronde, so be prepared. So the first question I have is that there can be a lot of environmental gains possible in the area of operation, aircraft operations, choice of route, choice of cost index, speed, etc. Everything on the cost of air transport. What are airline companies ready to do in this area in order to balance the need to reduce emissions, but also to maintain a reasonable cost basis? Who wants to take that one? Jonathan?
Yeah, no, sure. Actually, I see it the other way around. I mean, operational efficiency is a huge cost benefit. Our biggest single cost in the airline industry is our fuel burn. And when you add carbon pricing on top, you're talking about 35% to 40% of our cost base. So therefore, we're very focused on absolutely minimizing our fuel burn. And one of the big opportunities, as Nancy mentioned, is air traffic management. So there still is quite a lot of legacy inefficiency in the way we fly, particularly around Europe. I think we have 28 air traffic control authorities, and some of those routings are they're hugely inefficient. So there is a massive opportunity. We could save up to 10% of Europe's carbon emissions if we just move to best practice air traffic management. So we're very focused on, and so that's one aspect, also taking weight off aircraft and looking at any procedure that helps us reduce our fuel burn. So I think we're very aligned in terms of operational efficiency and the climate agenda.
Yeah, that actually dovetails very well into another question I've received here, which is concretely what gains are possible at the areas at the level of airports and air traffic control. We've spoken a lot about the airlines, but we've not really talked about that. We know that the airports have their own initiative in terms of controlling their own emissions, but what else can be done at the airport level or in air traffic control? We know the issues in Europe, and why aren't there more targets? This is the question I have. Why aren't there more targets set on airports and ATC in this regard? Who wants to take that one?
I think we all know that we could have a benefit up to 10% of CO2 emissions with a European single sky. So I think all European airlines are waiting for it in the short term, because it's available now, and we are all focusing on the short term.
It seems to me that this issue of air traffic management is something that doesn't really enter the public domain very much. It's something that everyone has talked about for decades in Europe. I know that I'm being very controversial here, but I'm doing it on purpose. I know that the European Union sees Single European Sky as one of its biggest sort of success programs, but the reality of operations on a day-to-day basis still seem to fall short of what the ideal would be. So that's maybe one area of focus. Any other of you want to make a comment on airport or air traffic control limitations?
I'd like to add on the airport side, because we do work pretty closely with the airports, and there are opportunities there that we've been pursuing. Gate electrification, for example. So when your aircraft is at the gate, instead of having to use the APU on the aircraft, we can use electricity. We've been doing a lot of work with airports on electrification of ground support equipment, and also being able to tow aircraft with electric small vehicles to be able to get them to where they need to be on the runway. And we really need to continue to partner with the airports. And I think from a perspective of being part of the Air Transport Action Group, one of the best things about that group is that we have the airports, the air navigation service providers, the manufacturers, and the airlines working together, because this really has to be a supply chain solution, and each of us has these different levers. So I think there is promise there, but probably relatively a lot less than what we can get with our aircraft, and so that has to be a key focus.
Okay. Michael, from ATAG, any comments?
Yeah, on the issue of air traffic management, it's interesting because we've heard from Eurocontrol that as a result of the pandemic and the reduced traffic levels, they're seeing aircraft being able to be operated in a much more rational and sensible manner, not going and taking massive detours around national airspace, and being able to fly direct routes. And they're saying that emissions are, as a result, being reduced by up to 50%. That's fantastic, because that's exactly what we've been saying for many, many years, as Anne referred to, Single European Sky. It's exactly the point. And so what I think would be fantastic is if we can take the opportunity of the recovery from COVID, when we see traffic growing slowly but steadily. Let's not step back from the way we've been managing to operate from an air traffic management perspective on a much more sensible basis. Let's integrate that back into the recovery phase, because the emissions savings are there. They're visible for everybody to see, and they could be really significant.
Okay, great.
Maybe on airports, we have 60% of our ramp engines that are electric at the moment. We are targeting 95% in the coming years, so we need a lot of electricity. And I think also even hydrogen seems to be a very disruptive technology. We don't know very much about it, but we have to prepare it with the airports anyway.
Okay, so the airports have a role to play, I guess, as well with alternative fuels in this regard. Okay, let me move on to one other question, which I think is a very key one. Maybe the solution is more economical than technological. What would be the impact of doubling airline ticket prices on demand and thus CO2 emissions? Achieving net zero by 2050 requires massive capital investments, much of which will be front-loaded. In light of the serious financial difficulties airlines are facing, including a massive decline in demand and repayment of government loans, how do you expect to pay for the necessary investments? Who wants to go on that one? Doubling of prices to restrict demand. Jonathan?
Yeah, well, I take a step back there. I mean, the way we solve climate change is through carbon pricing. So you put a price on carbon, thereby you incentivize organizations, you create greater incentives to reduce their carbon emissions. So it's not increasing airfares for the sake of it. It's doing it through a structured carbon pricing mechanism. Now, clearly, carbon pricing has many ways of reducing emissions through corsets, through offsets, emissions trading schemes, through caps and so on. But there is also a demand effect. So one of the things we did in the Sustainable Aviation Roadmap that was launched February of last year, out to 2050, we looked at what is the demand impact of carbon prices out to 2050. So, and it's quite interesting. We used the UK government's carbon prices, and we don't want to frighten everybody, but they're looking at, say, $400 per tonne by 2050. Now, when you look at the per ticket price, it doesn't sound so scary, but that's their view. So we assessed what's the carbon impact on demand, and it's about a 6% reduction. So there will be, carbon pricing does have an impact on, but what we're saying is the solution is not reduce demand in itself through taxes, do it through a structured carbon pricing program.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I also think policies that are structured to deny the ability of people to fly and ship their goods could be very wrong-headed. And we have a tremendous impact globally on lifting economies up and enabling cultural exchange. But more, critically, if you look at it, really, we power a lot of the economy. So I think the better solutions are more positive incentives to be able to help us do what we want to do, rather than siphoning away from the industry the money it needs to invest. And we need to, there's a lot of focus on environmental justice. I mean, are you going to say that my brother can't fly on an aircraft because he, works on the factory line instead of somebody who, Bill Gates or somebody like that? So I think we really need to be mindful of what kind of policies that we would be putting out there, and really focusing on things that really reduce our carbon emissions in our operations, rather than telling people don't fly.
Okay, good. We've got very little time left, but a couple of quick questions. One of them is, I'm roughly translating from French here, but what are the perspectives for another sort of common approach between the industry, represented by IATA, ATAG, etc., and the International Civil Aviation Organization in terms of taking this whole debate another step forward? I mean, what are the perspectives there? Do we think that things are going to happen? Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the prospects for that are extremely positive. We have the next ICAO assembly in 2022, and the world's governments have already agreed to put in place a process for negotiation of a long-term emissions reduction goal for the entire world. The industry has supported that. We'd like to see governments agree to a long-term goal which is at least as ambitious as what the industry has already agreed to. So I think the discussions there are moving in an extremely positive direction. And again, let me underline the point I made earlier. If we can do this in collaboration between industry and government, I think the prospects of success are all the more stronger. But we think that that's entirely possible and would be a very positive development.
Okay, great. All right. So last question, and this will sort of help us wrap up a little bit. And this is that this morning from Alexander de Juniac, we heard that he's expecting a lot from technology development, from new fuel types, and also from governments. But from your perspective as airline companies, what are the three most important things that you would like to see launched that is basically going to help you reach your climate objectives? Who wants to take that one? Why don't you give me one to save time, because we've only got a couple of minutes left.
Well, maybe I will begin. I think we all talked about the urgency to make SAF available and to have real policies to incentivize positively the SAF supply. I will also add what Nancy said. I think we must not forget that air transport industry's purpose is to unite all human beings, to share cultures, and to also support economic development for all countries. So I would ask governments to remember this when they build their framework and policies.
Okay. Anyone else? Michael?
Yeah, I think SAF's absolutely key. And one additional perspective is I think there's a lot of there's a fair amount of lack of understanding amongst the flying public of what SAF means. Many people don't realize, as we've talked about today, that it's here, it's now, it works, it's technically safe. And so I think we perhaps need to do a better job of telling that story externally, because what you'd hate to see is in 30 years' time, if the industry hasn't been allowed to grow and develop the way we'd like to see it, is for passengers to turn around and say, well, hang on, you had this solution called SAF and you didn't invest in that, you didn't make it a reality, you didn't bring it into deployment on commercial is there, so that governments have the policy driver to bring SAF to a market at scale. So I think we need to tell that story a lot better, and that's why discussions like this are so important.
Okay, Jonathan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about appropriate policy incentives for SAF, and I think linking to your last question, I think the EU about to launch a SAF mandate. We think that should be intra-EU, because we think ICAO can play a fantastic role in providing some SAF incentives on a global level. So we think international flights should be addressed through ICAO, and the EU should focus on providing those incentives within Europe.
Okay, and last but not least, Nancy?
Oh, definitely SAF, but I will say the message would be working in complementary ways with us. We are partnering and we want to partner. So let's not fight about this. Let's collaborate with governments on all of those levers of meeting our goals.
Okay, great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of our panel discussion, which I hope you found very interesting. I've learned a lot. I mean, I think one of the key messages coming out is the ongoing commitment from the airlines to continue their efforts in reducing emissions, that there are solutions out there. In the short to medium term, we've got operational solutions, but the biggest promise is from sustainable alternative fuels. But there we need more support from government policy, and that the industry sounds as if it's very willing to work in collaboration with governments to deliver on that promise. So with that, I'd really like to thank my panel. First of all, Anne Rigail for taking time to join us here today, Michael from Geneva, Jonathan from London, and Nancy, thanks again for getting up so early and joining us from Washington, DC. So ladies and gentlemen, that brings the end of this Perspectives of the Operators. We're now going to go into a 20-minute break, and then we'll rejoin and hear from, if you like, the other side of the fence, what the regulators have to say about this. So thanks again.